How do we know ourselves? To a surprising extent, it's just as the way other people know us, by observing our own actions and words and drawing inferences from that. So as we hear ourselves talk, we draw inferences about what our attitudes are. As we witness ourselves acting, we draw conclusions about how we must feel about a subject.
What, if anything, has changed about what people perceive money would bring them as far as happiness? I think what the literature says and your research says that above a certain amount of money, depending on where you live in the world, money doesn't bring any much more happiness at all. There's some diminishing returns. That's still
correct. So above a satiation point, as Daniel Kahneman, my Nobel Prize winning colleague, has called it, there's diminishing returns.
Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. I'm Larry Weeks. Today's podcast is about understanding ourselves a little bit better. And I have a question for you. Do you know what makes you happy? Now, that's a horrible question in the sense that things don't necessarily reach into our brain and turn on a happy button. It's how we interpret things. So I get that. But I mean, generally in your life, if I were to say, hey, do you know what makes you unhappy? I think we would all quickly identify what we don't like or what have you. And happiness is a complex subject. And I've got things that readily come to mind when I ask myself what makes me happy. But outside of those few things that come up immediately, it requires some thought. Where I'm going with this is I think all of us have fallen into the trap of doing things, let's say for money, because we think that's going to make us happy, and being miserable making the money that we thought that was going to make us happy. So that's kind of where I'm getting at. And that's where this conversation today goes. We're going to be exploring on the podcast the insights into psychology of happiness, self-perception, and the various intricate connections between our minds, bodies, social interactions, you name it. And my guest on the show is social psychologist David Myers, known for his extensive work in communicating this psychological science to both students and the general public. His academic contributions, supported by the National Science Foundation, have been published in prestigious journals like Science and the American Psychologist. David has made psychological research very accessible through articles in those magazines and in magazines like Scientific American, and through 17 books that would include both general interest and textbooks. In fact, David is best known for his textbook called Psychology, which is one of the most widely used psychology textbooks in the world. And he is also the author of several popular books in the field, including one of the first on happiness called The Pursuit of Happiness, Discovering the Pathway to Fulfillment, Well-Being, and Enduring Personal Joy. This was published back in 1993. Now, his newest book, How Do We Know Ourselves? Curiosities and Marvels of the Human Mind, is kind of the touchstone of this particular show. And a lot of my questions are geared toward the content in that book to David. But the conversation is wide-ranging when it comes to the field of psychology. When we talk about David's background and some of his textbooks, we revisit his book on happiness. It was published, like I said, back in the 90s. So we discuss the latest findings in the field, what has proven to be true, what's novel, so on and so forth. And we talk about the relationship between happiness and income. We talk about goal setting and the material trap, why we lean the ladder of success against the wrong wall many times. And when we discuss religion, the benefits of religion, and also what he calls the religious engagement paradox. And then we get into more of the concepts in the book around self-perception theory. And he offers up some great insights on how we can better understand ourselves. We talk about mind-body effects. And we have a fun discussion about micro-friendships, which is very interesting. And this is how we can get a significant mood boost from brief, positive interactions with strangers. So very interesting. We touch on misplaced fears, and we discuss fear in general and how we skew risk perceptions. And then we talk about the power of reframing and its effectiveness in brief interventions. And a lot of evidence in this area. So very interesting conversation, I thought. I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here's David. Hi, David. David, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Where do I find you? Where are you today?
I'm in my Hope College office at a place called Hope. It's in Western Michigan, Holland, Michigan, west of Grand Rapids and up just across the lake from Milwaukee.
Again, thank you for coming on. By the way, I was just going through your background and some of your books, and I looked at my library.
Oh, wow. What do you know?
And
a little bit of history.
It's marked up. I got some questions in here for you, but I thought, I was like, oh, okay. I think I got this in the late 90s, maybe. But
right.
I'm wondering if this was one of the first kind of books about happiness generally.
Sure. I think it was. Among books written by psychological scientists about happiness and well-being, this was perhaps the first general audience trade book, followed by many others.
Yeah, they're all over the place.
Mine, for whom I have great respect.
So, but you're a pioneer here, and I was going through. It's marked up, so I got some questions about this.
Okay,
I want to specifically want to know what's the latest has been. What do we know, or what have we kept up on that's true that we didn't know, or no longer true that we thought we knew about happiness? Tell me, your CV is very lengthy, and you're a very accomplished individual. Tell me what you're doing these days.
So my primary vocation, Larry, is still authoring psychology texts, both introductory psychology and social psychology. And so reading all of psychological science and reporting on that. I also have a blog, talkpsych.com, just set off for editing a new blog essay this morning on teen depression and how smartphone and social media use contribute to it. And so
okay,
I have a really cool job. It's just kind of
that's a cool
looking for the most interesting, humanly significant information coming out in psychological science and reporting on it.
So back to this book, Pursuit of Happiness. As I was perusing, as I told you, by the way, people that are not seeing this, I'm holding up a copy of David's book, The Pursuit of Happiness. I think it was published in 92 or something like that.
Correct.
I guess, right? Yeah.
Just over 30 years ago.
Discovering the Pathway to Fulfillment, Well-Being, and Enduring Personal Joy. As I was going through the book and my highlights, some of this, a lot of this still seems not only relevant, but it's held up over the years. There's a section here on which within any country are the richest people the happiest. And it talks about money and happiness, and that's a big topic of interest for many people. And this seems to have held up. And I think you addressed it a little bit in the new book, by the way, which is good. Since you've written this book, what, if anything, has changed about what people perceive money would bring them as far as happiness? I think what the literature says and your research says that above a certain amount of money, depending on where you live in the world, money doesn't bring any much more happiness at all. There's some diminishing returns. That's still
correct. So above a satiation point, as Daniel Kahneman, my Nobel Prize winning colleague, has called it, there's diminishing returns. I won't say there's no increase in happiness with further increase in income, but the curve sort of levels off. By the way, Larry, economists have become very interested in the money happiness question. And so we've seen a lot of recent research from economists. Some of them have argued that no, there's a continuing linear increase in happiness with increasing log income. Economists like to use logarithmic income, and I won't get into the mathematics of that, but that's not you and I don't go to the store and buy things with log money. We use real absolute dollars.
I'm a nerd. Yeah.
So what the more recent studies have shown across multiple nations is that When you increase from poverty to being able to afford life's necessities and thus gain more control over your life as well, there is an increase in life satisfaction and self-reported happiness. But as you get above that level where you have more than enough to afford life's necessities, maybe $80,000 a year for an average American, and you have a sense of control over your life, then further increases in income, the next 40,000, let's say, adds less than did the last 40,000 to your happiness. And so if you think that by getting more and more money, which is what you're driven to do, as you still earn more and more, you still aspire to more and more, you're going to become happier and happier. No, you're going to adapt to what you have. It's going to take maybe a higher high to reduce the joy. But it's exactly as you said, there's a kind of leveling off, a diminishing in the increase in happiness with further increases in income and consumption. And all that's relevant to how we can create a sustainable future. Or do we make ourselves happier if we consume more and more? Do we make our children happier if we make them wealthy rather than just secure? Answers are no and no.
You mentioned some of the figures, and I think maybe in your books, or I'm conflating everything I've read now about happiness, and including your recent work. There was something to do like in poor nations, I think it was 40,000 was kind of the satiation point, or, that
right.
cut off. And then in the Western, or, the more wealthier nations, 80 or 90,000. It used to be 70 some years ago. Now it's risen a little bit.
Right.
But
and of course, that depends on where you live too.
Sure. You go to, if you're in San Jose, California,
right?
you're
versus North Dakota.
Yeah. A shack is going to cost you, $2.5 million. Is this where we deceive ourselves? So am I even aware that my satiation point, unless I'm asked, cuts off at a certain amount? Here's where I'm going. There's something that fights against happiness, and that's comparisons, right? When we compare ourselves, we usually don't compare down. We usually compare up. So if we're not aware of these stats, does it matter? Because if if I'm making 100 grand and I'm comparing myself to someone making 200 grand, I'm unhappy. That satiation point didn't hit for me because I have a comparison problem. Okay.
Right. Comparison is the thief of joy. Teddy Roosevelt.
It's odious. Would Shakespeare say comparisons are odious? How would I either couple or decouple these two things? Would I say, wait a minute, I got to stop comparing to the higher income, look at my own life. Sure. And can I be happy with what I have, or am I making myself unhappy with what I don't have?
Well, it's a good question, and I understand it. And two thoughts. One, if you want to feel satisfaction, expose yourself to those who have less. People who've been volunteers in a burn unit in a hospital have a feeling of gratitude for their own relative health. People who've experienced, abject poverty. I have a daughter that works in South Africa and is out in the townships sometime. When you expose yourself to that, you have a sense of an appreciation of your own blessings. You can count your blessings. That's one comment. The other comment is, do people not appreciate that there's an upper limit to the extent to which increasing income increases happiness? I think they don't. And the evidence, one bit of evidence for that is in the annual UCLA American Council on Education survey called the American Freshman. Every year, UCLA surveys a cross-section of about 250,000 entering collegians in their first week on campus. And once again, in the most recent survey, when asked to indicate the importance of different life objectives, the number one rated life objective was becoming very well off financially, which 80% of people entering college rate as very important or essential, more important than raising a family, helping others in difficulty, and other laudable life goals. So, and this is much higher than it was back in the 1960s, which were a less materialistic era than the era in which we now live. So we certainly do have the idea, not just that earning a stable, secure income, but becoming very well off financially is extremely or very important to life success and satisfaction. That's the belief of today's entering collegians.
Wow. So I'm not surprised, but the stories of the very well-off, wealthy, famous, what have you, who are very unhappy, who've committed suicide, who are addicted to drugs, they're numerous. They're numerous, and
Right.
and we don't learn from those lessons. Yeah.
And lottery winners, they'll be elated for a time, but once they adapt to their new circumstance, it's very hard to sustain that euphoria that comes with sudden wealth.
I was trying to think of a heuristic or something to help myself or others as we talk about this who are listening. One of the things that came into my mind is the phrase, is it worth it? Right? Is it worth it? So I have a good friend who's a partner in a law firm, and he's got enough money. So he's already, he's been a partner for many, many years, but he's still, and he doesn't like his work at all. And for the most part, the unhappiness that leaks out of him or the complaints, it's about work, right? And it's constant. And the pandemic shut some things down for a while. And I remember, we were together, and he seemed at peace. He seemed happier. I said, what's going on with you? What? And he said, I'm not going to an office, and we're not doing this crazy stuff right now. Everything is, and he goes, I've given up. It's okay. I don't need this. But then, so he was going to retire. So he went to go in. Then they threw a lot of money. A case came in. They threw a ton of money at him and said, if you stay, and we had this long discussion. I said, how many hours? He said, it's going to be 70 hours. It's going to, blah, 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 blah. And he was hesitant, but he still was kind of hooked by the number. And I said, we've done the math. You don't need this money. I said, what? He said, but Larry, if I only do it for 6 months, I really don't have to work. I don't have to worry, but then I really, really don't. So it's just human nature. I would probably have the same temptation myself, right? It's just, we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? And how much is enough?
Sure. But of course, your friend, if he made an obscene amount of money, could do other things with it for other people too. He doesn't have to just consume it on it himself.
Yes, true. Is there anything in the happiness field that of late that you find surprising, that's novel or we didn't know before? Just wanted to.
The first thing I'd say is that most of what we understood 30 years ago has held up.
Okay.
So, for example, what really, really matters are our close relationships. We have a deep need to belong, and people who enjoy close friendships or a satisfying marriage are much more likely to report themselves very happy and to seem very happy to other people than those who don't enjoy close, mutually supportive relationships. We also have reconfirming evidence time and again that certain traits like a positive self-esteem, an optimistic outlook, a feeling of control over one's life, these tend to be predictive of happiness. Another thing I talked about in the book, I have a chapter, one of the later chapters on, is religious engagement. And here, the more recent research has given us a little more nuanced picture. So it continues to be true that people who are actively religious engaged with a faith community are much more likely to say that they're very happy than those who are not religiously engaged. And by the way, that religious engagement does entail a social support network. It's a community of faith that enables people to support one another. So that's part of the package, as well as to find meaning and hope and so forth for their lives. But there's a different way of slicing it. This is all true if you cut across individuals within, say, the United States or any other country. First of all, it turns out to be, this is especially true within relatively more religious countries like the United States, that greater religious engagement is predictive of happiness. Secondly, if you compare religious and irreligious places in the aggregate, like compare Mississippi with Vermont or Alabama with Oregon, you have a relatively religious versus irreligious state. Or if you compare a relatively religious country, such as, let's say, Egypt versus Sweden, the less religious country or state tends to be a happier place. and to enjoy all kinds of other, they have higher levels of education, higher income, lower rates of smoking, more longevity. Life is better in less religious states and places. Okay. But life is better, and there's lower arrest rates, lower smoking rate, greater longevity, greater happiness among religious individuals. So I call this the religious engagement paradox. Greater religiosity leads to greater human flourishing across individuals, but to less human flourishing when you compare places in the aggregate. Very interesting paradoxical phenomenon. And so what Ed Diener, one of the now deceased, but he was the Jedi master of the world's happiness researchers, and Louis Tay, one of his doctoral students, and I did, is an analysis that control for certain other factors like income and education. And when you do that, then the negative correlation between the religiosity of a place and the flourishing of its people goes away. And so that kind of resolves the paradox. So all I'm saying, that may sound a little complex to your listeners, but it's kind of, we have more nuanced findings here, but the findings still confirm, as does the work by the way, Tyler Vanderweel and the Human Flourishing Project at Harvard, that religious engagement across individuals is predictive of human flourishing.
It seems we are losing that sense of community generally in this country, but this is just my perception that, that may have been more common in the past, but who knows?
I think that sense is right, Larry, that individualism is greater today than in the past in the United States, and greater today in the United States than in other nations as well. And maybe that contributes. Just this morning, I was reading higher rates of shoplifting and all kinds of, lower rates of charitable contributions today among young Americans than in the past. I think your intuition is onto something.
So as we leave the happiness topic here, one more thing is it's still kind of what's the split in our happiness in terms of what we inherit, in our DNA, what our emotional set point is versus what we can do to increase happiness. Is it 50-50? Is it, what percent?
Sure. So the heritability of human happiness, by which we mean variation among individuals, is close to 50%. And it's sort of like your body weight, maybe, or your cholesterol levels. They're genetically influenced, but there's also things you can do to tweak or adjust or influence your physiology and your cholesterol level or your smoking or whatever. All these things are biologically and genetically influenced, but they're also subject to willpower and self-control. And so that's why we have some of these wonderful new books, like my colleague Sonia Lubomirsky on the How of Happiness, which is giving guides to happiness. And by the way, my own website, davidmyers.org, that's MYERS, davidmyers.org, has a place. If you go to the happiness section, you can click on some evidence-based tips for how to have a more flourishing, happier life.
On the to-do list of, so I have my set point, to your point,
right,
to what we just discussed. Is there an 80-20? Is there a domino that helps the other dominoes falls from what you can do to be happier? And would that be relationships?
Yeah, I would say the evidence is strongest for the importance of human connections, of close, supportive, self-disclosing, equitable relationships between people, between you and people you love and who love you. If you have that and not a lot of money, you're happy. If you have none of that and a ton of money, you're likely not happy.
Yeah, people tend to seem to be passive in that area versus work life or other areas where they put a lot of effort in. They seem to wait for relationships to come when no, that's that you have to plant a seed. There's some work that has to be done, right?
Right. Sure. We can invest in relationships just as your attorney friend does in his job.
Yep. And by the way, you have some interesting things about micro friendships in your new book. So let's move your book. How do we know ourselves? And I like to approach it from some different angles here. But let's start with the self-perception principle.
So this little book, How Do We Know Ourselves? Curiosities and Marvels of the Human Mind, is a collection of 40 essays. And the first is what the book's title is drawn from, How Do We Know Ourselves? And this is a little exposition of what's called self-perception, theory and research on self-perception. How do we know ourselves? To a surprising extent, it's just as the way other people know us, by observing our own actions and words and drawing inferences from that. So as we hear ourselves talk, we draw inferences about what our attitudes are. As we witness ourselves acting, we draw conclusions about how we must feel about a subject. Now, that sounds kind of backwards, but Daryl Bem, who's a researcher, found a lot of evidence to support this. And follow-up science finds that, for example, if you can manipulate people into a facial expression by saying, like maybe manipulate them into a smile by having them turn up the corners of their mouth as electrodes are attached so they can get a good connection. And then, what do you know? They feel happier. They find cartoons funnier. And likewise, if people are coaxed into walking down the hall with their head high and their arms swinging, they feel happier, even though they're not told to be happier than if they shuffle down the hall with their head down. So the moral seems to be, act as if you're happy, and you'll draw inferences from that, and you'll feel happier. Mirror others' expressions, by the way, and you can feel what they feel. So bottom line is simply, how do we know ourselves? Partly it's simply by observing ourselves, our words and our actions, and drawing inferences from that.
So this is interesting because I think for years I've heard aphorisms or things around, hey, if you're feeling bad, adjust your posture. I think the motivational guru Tony Robbins and others are, they have these admonitions about posture and standing up. And I think there was something, a TED talk about the power position, even,
right.
Things
power
like this.
Posing.
Right. Power posing and how these, and smiling to the example that you gave. But I didn't really know any the science or the studies behind it. So these things have been replicated. David, by the way, I know you have a whole thing on replication as well. But
right.
but these things are, in your opinion, fairly proven that yes, you can take some actions with your bodies that influence attitudes and emotions and what have you.
Right. So people who are viewing this can replicate a little experiment. Take a pen or pencil and put it between their teeth versus between their lips. When you put it between your teeth, you're activating muscles involved in smiling. When you put it between your lips, you're activating muscles involved in scowling or frowning.
I just feel silly right now. Yeah, I just feel
and some research finds that affects human emotions. So it's an example of what's called the facial feedback effect. Now, by the way, other research didn't replicate that finding, but more recent research shows that now it really is a genuine finding. And the studies that didn't replicate it had put a camera on people and made them feel very self-conscious and sort of distorted their emotions. So this is an example, by the way, of where there's question about replication, but it really does replicate if done in a more natural context.
Yeah. So, by the way, is there time? Is there a certain amount of time?
For a short-term effect, right?
But you don't have to do it. So what I'm saying, it's short-term effect after the fact, but is it also, you don't have to do it for very long to feel some effect?
It's immediate.
Okay. Immediate. Okay.
Just try it. Put that pencil between your teeth and between your lips and you'll feel the difference.
Okay. So this is interesting because you can, it seems, get to your brain through your body. So if you're down or what have you, you can, if you can't get your brain to kind of turn around the emotional state, you you can influence it via the body. Is that right? Is that
right?
Is that a
Right.
takeaway? Okay.
Yeah, and so there's a whole field of research on embodied cognition, as it's called, and so
yeah, we think from within a body, right? The brain
yeah,
networks
exactly.
that process our sensations communicate with the brain networks. It's all part of the thinking, right?
Right. So
Yeah.
if people in some experiments hold a warm cup of tea, they actually feel warmer and express warmer attitudes than if they're in a very cold context. And so it's just an example of embodied cognition.
David, there's an interesting, so this I think this was in the 90s as well. Geez, we're doing some time travel here, David, but there's a program called Body for Life. And some people listening may remember this, but it was a guy named Bill Phillips had this 12-week program, and he started this whole challenge. Nowadays, 30-day challenges, 90-day, there are all these challenges.
Oh, right.
Bill was one of the first kind of, I think, to start this kind of thing, but it was about diet and bodybuilding and body composition, changing your body. So he would offer money and some prizes, would send in a before and after photo. So the before photo is, you're overweight or whatever it is. And then you would go through this 12-week and then send in a photo after of the changes in your body. And he would offer a diet plan. It was a great marketing tool because he was selling supplements and other things. So that aside, I never did it, but I would always, I'd be on the newsletter, on the list. I would look at the winners. I would see all the admonitions. Here's what's interesting. The stories that people report, David, not only did some of these people change their body composition, but other things, big changes in their lives happened at the same time. Like they would get a promotion at work, or they would do something they never did. They went back to school. There was something to do with the body and the things that they were doing physically to change their body composition that affected, it seems, their whole lives. There was this bleed over effect.
A couple thoughts. One, in experiments on willpower development, people who develop their willpower muscles, so to speak, that can generalize to other areas of their life. Plus, there's some really interesting research that I mentioned at the end of the essay on New Year's resolutions that last. By the way, it does help to make a New Year's resolution. People who state goals are more likely to reach goals than those who don't have goals. It helps to announce those goals publicly, to develop a strategy for actually implementing them day by day, to monitoring progress and recording that progress, to creating an environment that supports you if you want to lose weight, getting certain foods out of your cupboards or whatever. But the last thing, and this is the really interesting part, is to make a habit of that new practice that you want. And the question is, how long do you have to do it before it becomes an automatic thing you would need to do? If you want to exercise more, for example, how many days in a row do you have to force yourself to exercise before you no longer have to force yourself? You want to do it. And if you don't do it, you feel like a slug. By the way, when we finish our conversation here, I'm going to be heading over to my college gym. It's just something I have to do. My day won't feel right if I haven't done it.
Yeah.
Well, the answer is, on average, from research done in the UK, it depends on what it is you're trying to change, but about 66 days. So if our listeners want to change themselves in some significant way, form some healthy new habit, it takes effort. It takes self-discipline. I know it's hard. It's not easy, but do it for 2 months every day, and it'll start to become part of your life and just automatic.
Yeah, for those contemplating learning something. So one way is we talk about something generalizing to other areas of your life, taking a course, learning a new skill. These things in and of themselves are beneficial. It seems they also have these downstream effects elsewhere in your life. So it's learn a new skill, go out there, learn how to dance, do something. I remember taking up martial arts when I was very, very young, and it was so new and so novel. It wasn't just that I enjoyed it, but it expanded my world. To me, these things that we're talking about are world expanding and experience expanding that have benefits across your life. That's the end of my sermon. I think in the book you allude to, or actually are explicit with, can we periodically check in with our actions and behaviors for a better self-understanding? That if we look at our behaviors as if we're looking at someone else, can we discern who we are and what we like from that?
That's the whole premise of self-perception theory, that we know ourselves exactly as you just described, Larry. So yes.
But I need a high level self-awareness, right? I need to.
But
Okay.
often we do that naturally. We see how we've reacted in a particular social situation. Maybe we found ourselves getting angry, and then we afterwards say, "Whoa, that really mattered to me."
I need to tune in
Right.
and go, oh, well, okay, this is saying something about me.
Right.
What is it? Right.
Right. What did I learn about myself from this interaction,
There
or
you go.
this experience, or the way I reacted?
Right. I'm going to be a field journalist on myself. Right.
Exactly.
Hey, how did I behave in the wild? Oh,
Right.
What does that mean? Okay. All right. Thank you. Tell me about the availability heuristic and how it plays a role in how we fear, and then how it shapes our perception of events around us.
Right. The availability heuristic. By the way, heuristics are kind of cognitive rules of thumb, so to speak. They're just kind of automatic ways of thinking. And Daniel Kahneman, whom I referred to earlier, the great Nobel Prize winning psychologist for creating behavioral economics, introduced us to research on the availability heuristic, which is the tendency to judge the frequency of events, not in terms of their statistical frequency, but how readily available they are in memory. So as we're having this conversation, a mass shooting has just occurred in the state of Maine. And people in the United States have already expressed fears of being the victim of a mass shooting. And surely those fears will be enhanced by the massive publicity of the 18 people killed in a mass shooting in Maine. Are our fears in accord with our actual risk of being the victim of mass shooting? There are like 332 million Americans. About 100 are killed each day with guns, by the way, of which earlier this week, 18 were killed in a mass shooting. So that's just a few hours in an average day. The answer is no. The availability heuristic can lead us greatly astray. My favorite example of this is people's fears of flying versus driving. In recent National Safety Council data, we are mile per mile about 500 times safer on a commercial airliner than we are in a vehicle on the road. After 9/11, Americans stopped flying because they had these readily available images of airplane crashes and terrorist acts. And so we feared flying because that was what was cognitively available in mind. We don't think statistically, we think in terms of readily available images of vivid happenings. And I calculated that if in the next year, as a result of those fears, Americans who were flying 20% fewer miles drove half those unflown miles, because up here in Michigan, we were going to drive to spring vacation down with you in Florida, Larry, rather than flying, then we could project, given the greater risk of driving, that the terrorists would kill an additional 800 Americans on America's highways during that next year. A German researcher did what I should have thought to do, but was foolishly didn't even think to do, and that is a couple of years later, check out that prediction. And it turned out I had the right idea, but I underestimated. The terrorists actually killed an additional 1,500 excess deaths on American highways because of excess driving rather than flying. And so this is just one example of how the availability heuristic leads us to fear the wrong things very often. That is, to fear what there are dramatic instances of, what's vividly in the news, rather than what really puts us at risk. And so we fear for swimming off your Florida waters, we fear shark bites because we can have, having seen Jaws, readily available images in our mind of being bitten by a shark, even though the likelihood of that happening is probably less than the likelihood of dying driving to the beach.
So based on that concept, if in fact the news reported traffic deaths and accidents as they do other fairly, a plane going down is so rare that it's big news, right?
Correct.
But so
in a sense, it's been said, if it leads the news tonight, it's something that hardly ever happens.
That's a great way to put it. So, but if it's interesting, so I don't fear flying, but what's interesting is I'm on the road. I'm probably more tuned into it now, how risky driving is, and this seems to have been exacerbated since the pandemic, but it could be just some perception in my mind. But man, traffic is crazy. People are driving crazy. And I have near misses quite frequently that I fairly soon dismiss out of mind, right? Like cars just barely almost hitting me, or I almost hitting them, whatever. And it happens frequently, but then it kind of dissipates. There's something I'm getting used to that's odd, right?
Whereas if you think statistically, which is thinking in terms of reality, then say for me, the scariest part of my flying to Florida from Michigan is the drive to the Grand Rapids airport. Once I'm in the loving care of Delta Airlines, I can relax. And I actually do, because I believe the numbers.
I never think I'll ever hear that term again, the loving care of Delta Airlines. They need to hire you. Now, let's talk about micro connections. This is fascinating to me. Right. These are casual chats. These are fleeting interactions, right?
Right.
I'm just meeting somebody, saying hi and what have you.
So this is inspired by research by my social psychologist colleague, Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago. And he and others find that what I call micro friendships, fleeting positive interactions with people, can brighten both our days and their days. And so what he, for example, in one of his experiments in Chicago, did was ask some people, but not others, as they entered into their morning commute into the city, to chat up the person on the subway next to them or on the elevated train next to them. And those who did so, as opposed to others, were, when they finished that ride, feeling happier, and so were their conversation partners. And others have done this sort of research with people who are entering a coffee shop, engaging some of them, but are randomly assigned not others, in chatting up the barista, after which they feel happier if they've engaged in this micro interaction. Or greeting a bus driver in Turkey versus not greeting the bus driver and smiling at the bus driver. And so what this research suggests is that these small acts of kindness leave both the giver and the recipient feeling better afterwards. And the practical lesson that we can apply to our own lives is take a little initiative. Chat up the grocery store clerk. Reach out to lost friends. Talk to the server. Don't just ignore the server. Have a little brief exchange. And because we're social animals, as Aristotle said, if we'll push our comfort zone, maybe talk to the rideshare driver a little bit rather than just stay silent in the back, you'll brighten their day and you'll brighten your own. And that's the happy science of micro friendships.
What I love about this, first, is I do this, but I wasn't trying to make myself happier. I don't know what drives me. My wife it concerns her occasionally, but I talk to strangers all the time, and I try to make a connection. I don't know why, but.
And Larry, maybe you do that partly because you're a natural extrovert. You're naturally outgoing. You're interested in people. That's why you host a successful podcast and enjoy doing so. What the research found is that even introverts who force themselves to have these brief micro interactions with others whom they encountered in their daily lives were happier after pushing their zone of comfort to do so.
That's what I love about this is an easy thing, because you're interacting with people out of necessity at the mail room or at the UPS store or at the grocery store or at the restaurant. These are little opportunities for little pieces of happiness that you can accumulate during the day. These are opportunities, right?
Right. Exactly.
Now, it is challenging if you're an introvert to kind of push that, but it's, according to what you're telling me, it's well worth it. One of the benefits that I've also encountered is that, especially if you go to a similar restaurant, on a monthly basis or weekly, but whatever it is, they're not only micro, they are now genuine friendships that right. If the same people work there, they know you, it's like the Cheers bar, no harm,
exactly.
They know you. So it's cool.
When I go to my local coffee shop, Cheryl, who's the proprietor, greets me with a hug and how are you doing? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Now, what I didn't know, and I thank you for sharing that, is that I didn't know how it affected them. Right. I didn't
right.
know, but you're saying it benefits both if there's a positive connection there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that's a good thought. That
Right.
makes me feel good, right?
Yeah. So, by the way, that was one of my favorite essays in this little book on the curiosities and marvels of the human mind.
It's really great.
I'm glad you like that too.
I love it. Well, because obviously it validates something I've been doing in a way. I was in Daytona. There was some kind of parade. We were with some friends, and they were taking us to this parade. So everybody's lined up on the streets. And I don't know why I did this, but I go and I think there was no chairs to sit down, and there was a guy sitting down. I walked up to this guy, I said, "Hey, can I just use your lap?" He said, "Sure," joking. I sat down on his lap, and everybody got a laugh, and I'm like, I'm embarrassing my wife again. But we struck up a conversation, and he said, "My gosh, you look like a friend of mine I just lost, like earlier in the year."
Oh, wow.
And we had this whole conversation, and it wasn't a sad moment for him. It was a good moment because he was reminded of his friend. He pulled out a picture, showed me his friend, and we did look alike. And anyway, that's just an encouragement for all the introverts.
The encounter you just reported, Larry, reminds me of some of the stories I tell at the end of this essay, because I invited Facebook friends to contribute examples for their own life where they chatted up somebody and it turned out to be really significant. And the stories are just heart-rending.
Yeah. This was one such story. So I really like that. I don't think I've ever encountered or blindsight or understood blindsight. This is fascinating to me. Could you tell me what blindsight is, or for our audience here?
It is indeed a fascinating phenomenon. First of all, the phenomenon is that some people who are consciously blind have another visual system that's outside their awareness that enables them to navigate the world. And so with these brain injured blind sight people who can't see a chair in the hall in front of them, as they walk down the hall, they will navigate around that chair. Or if given an envelope to put into a mail slot that is at differing angles, they will deny that they're able to do it because they can't see it. But if asked to guess, they can reliably put the envelope through the slot. And so, as David Milner at University of St. Andrews has said, is one of the researchers of this, studying one of these patients who happened to live in St. Andrews, Scotland, it's as if there's a zombie within, to use his words. And this is illustrative of a larger human phenomenon, which is what we call implicit cognition. Our conscious awareness we're consciously aware of our attitudes, our memories, our prejudices, and so forth. But there's another level of human thought that is implicit. It's automatic. It's out of sight. It's not Freud's unconscious, which was seething with aggression and sexuality. This is just automatic information processing in the form of implicit memories that people who are brain damaged and cannot form new memories may not realize what they've learned. And so you can teach these people a new skill, like how to solve a block stacking puzzle. And then you present them with a puzzle and they'll say, I don't know how to do this. And you tell them, well, try, and they'll solve it like a practice expert because they're not aware of what they know. It's an implicit memory. And likewise, we have implicit as well as explicit attitudes. That is, kind of implicit attitudes would be kind of our automatic instant reactions to certain situations or people, even without our conscious awareness of those attitudes or what's driving them. So blind sight is vision without awareness, if you will, or it's visual processing without awareness. And it's an example of a larger phenomenon of what we call dual processing. We have a two-track mind, a two-track brain. It's partly explicit and conscious, but there's a very large implicit unconscious level of information processing. And it's one of the big lessons of the last 25 years of psychological science.
Is blind. So this lends me to want to ask you about intuition. Is intuition in this body brain kind of intelligence system? It is. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink, and I think he mentioned a phenomenon called thin.
By Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, and he wrote about a phenomenon called thin slicing. And one of the stories he mentioned was a coach was watching a tennis match. He was there with him, and the coach was watching these professionals play the match. And when a certain person was serving, he would say, "Uh-oh," and then they would default. He would know, he could pick up when they were about to default the serve. He could pick up something when the server is going to go off that no one else could detect. Malcolm called this thin slicing, and I think that the gist of his point was that there's so much information that this coach has taken in and learned and taught over the years that there's certain things outside of his conscious mind that unconsciously he could just kind of sense that, okay, something is off. A form of intuition, if you will. So my question to you is, what is intuition, and is it, involved in this brain body kind of intelligence?
Right. So your question is a great one, because blind sight is an example of human intuition, of kind of automatic knowledge of the world around us. And the research on thin slices that Malcolm Gladwell builds on in his book on intuition is a great example. And other examples of that would be people's reading others' emotions almost instantly. Students, for example, exposed to just a 10-second video of somebody's teaching a class can make a reasonably accurate guess of that professor's end of the semester student evaluations, because there's certain things about you, your warmth, your energy, and so forth, and your voice that come through immediately. You pick it up in very thin slices. Or think also of domains of where you have expertise. Intuition is often, the great psychologist and also Nobel Prize winner Herbert Simon said, experience that forms into kind of automatic expertise. And so a chess master can just look at a board and know what this next move is. Or an experienced medical diagnostician can see a patient walk in the office and kind of immediately recognize an issue there, just as the tennis expert can take one look at somebody in the process of serving and make a judgment. I have a book, actually, Larry. It's entitled Intuition, Its Powers and Perils. And so part of the book is on these powers of intuition, of automatic information processing. The other part is on the perils of thinking that we have correct intuition when we really don't, as we discussed earlier, fearing the wrong things, thinking we're in more danger on a plane than we are in a car, or that mass shooters are a greater risk to us than a lot of other things that are actually real risks to us, or thinking that we can outguess the efficient marketplace by our intuition about what's going to happen. Or
I have a feeling it's going to go up, or I have a feeling something's
or thinking that we can detect lies that other people are telling, when that's actually a very difficult thing to do. Or interviewers for an employer thinking that they can judge a future employee's success in the job from a brief subjective conversational interview, when in fact their intuitions turn out to be much poorer predictors than other predictors of job performance. So there are powers and there are perils to human intuition, and part of what our science has done is identify what each are. So that's a great question.
Without going into a whole lot of detail here, because I'm aware of the time, but give me the demarcation. Tell me at a high level how to use intuition, and let me tee it up for you, because I just had this conversation with a guy named Shane Parrish about intuition, and he made the point of, if you have experience in a domain, a lot of it you've accumulated, your intuition is, you should probably tune into that in that area. Outside of that, where you don't have much experience at all, that kind of builds up this intelligence that you can automatically draw from, that runs in the background. You should probably double check and not just go with your gut there.
Larry, I couldn't say it any better than you just have. And then
yes.
Add to that. I mean, in the first case, I think of Pascal, the heart has its reasons, the reason doesn't know. When you have acquired expertise, listen to your heart, because it's telling you something. Mm-hmm. But Solomon said, he that trusteth in his own heart is a fool. There's other areas where we don't have a lot of experience, and we overestimate our own expertise. David Dunning, a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, created what came to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the tendency for incompetent people to overestimate their own competence. I was just in correspondence with him this week about an incident that happened some years ago where bank robbers in Pittsburgh painted their face with lemon juice, which they thought made them invisible to the cameras, but it didn't. So they were soon apprehended. But it was a case where their own incompetence led them to behave incompetently, and because they didn't appreciate their incompetence. So part of wisdom is knowing the limits of your own knowledge.
David, you can't just throw that story out without. So there's a group, not just one. There was a group of people that thought if they put lemon juice on their faces or whatever.
There were two bank robbers in Pittsburgh in 1975.
Okay. All right.
They'd read this and they had tested out on something, and there must have been a defect and it didn't work. So
the mirror was broken or so. Well, that's crazy. Okay. This has been great, David. And I want to end here with reframing, because in your book, you were talking about interventions, I think, about how you can help teenagers or certain class of people at certain parts of their lives, and where a lot of money and resources was spent in some cases to prevent, kids from turning out bad, or, whatever the situation, circumstance was. But what really, and all of that was random. It was 50-50 whether any of that money and time spent would work. I'm oversimplifying it, but what did work was reframing an experience at the moment that experience happened.
Right. So on the one hand, there's a lot of well-intentioned efforts in which a lot of money and time that have been invested to prevent juvenile delinquents from a life of future crime, or which have been found actually, sadly, to be.
And I'm going to point people to the book. Yeah, they should look at the research there.
Totally ineffective. But surprisingly, there have been some what are called wise interventions, brief evidence-based interventions at key times in people's lives, like middle school students that are at risk, or entering minority college students, or new moms who are helped to, at key times in their lives when the twig is being bent, to have a different way of interpreting life events, to achieve more of what Angela Duckworth has called a growth mindset, to think that their efforts can, like a muscle, make them grow stronger in being able to cope with life's events. And as they're led to kind of just interpret their experience differently through these brief interventions, students have gotten better grades. New parents have understood their children better and been less abusive to them. There have been a number of good consequences. I will say that this research, more than any other I report in this book, kind of challenges my own, thinking, like, really? These brief interventions can have enduring effects? So I want to see more replications, but there have been enough replications that I have to give this some credence.
But the brief interventions were reframes.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Some of it's helping you reframe or reinterpret experiences that you're having.
So somebody, I'm going to make this up, but let's say somebody fails a test or bombs on stage or whatever, right?
Right.
Young, impressionable, or they're doing something for the first time. At the moment or soon after, around there, somebody coming to that person and reframing that experience, helping them reframe it, were some of the kind of the interventions, correct? They would reframe that experience so that they could take something positive or learn from it versus let it defeat them. Yeah.
Sure. So we social psychologists talk a lot about attributions. That is, what do people attribute their experiences? And so if you have a bad experience and you attribute it internally, the problem is mine. I don't have the competence. I don't have the energy or whatever to succeed. It's always going to be this way. It's never going to get better. And you have a different outlook than if you have an external attribution or explanation of the events. I had a bad day. It was a super hard exam. I didn't study hard enough, but I could certainly study harder on the next one. And so, yeah, it's how you frame it, how you interpret it, to what you attribute your experience. That's part of this. But there are various wise, brief interventions that have been attempted, and I give some examples of in the essay. And
yeah, that's great. I had a friend of mine who was scammed with some kind of timeshare thing, what have you, and she just felt stupid, right? Like this, And I said, look, I want you to imagine a gymnasium. 2,000 people fill that gymnasium. That's how many or more right now are being scammed in this kind of thing. This is a scam. This is meant to fool people. You are not alone. This is not you failing. This is just, you're a victim, right?
Right.
And that reframe seemed to help. So, Dave, this has been fantastic. How do people find you? Is it your website?
Yeah, and davidmyers.org. Just got to spell Myers correctly. Myers, davidmyers.org. Be happy to hear from anybody. And they can read a lot of free material and see a link to this new book of essays that I so enjoyed writing. Sort of a buffet of hors d'oeuvres of psychological science, little short essays that could be read in 5 minutes by the bedside.
Yeah, it's great. I love that format, the essays. I don't know why this came to mind, but are personality profile tests valid at all? Are any of them?
It depends what test we're talking about. For some, there's a great deal of supportive evidence. For others, such as
there's nothing for Myers-Briggs.
The Myers-Briggs, if I dare say,
that's a made up, right?
There's not a lot of supporting evidence.
Yeah. Okay. David, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate talking.
I enjoyed it too, Larry, and I'm so delighted that you welcomed me to be your guest today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again.
I'm honored by your attention, and thank you for your interest. And wish you a good day.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit LarryWeeks.com, and we will talk again soon.